Sometimes a man reaches a point where he just wants to disappear from the world. For Roy Baxter, that moment came when he bought a broken-down cabin in the Colorado mountains for $5, thinking he'd found the perfect place to spend his last years alone. Roy was tired of running, tired of remembering, tired of carrying guilt that followed him everywhere he went. The old house seemed abandoned, sitting empty on county records, and all Roy wanted was peace and quiet. But when he walked through that front door, he heard footsteps upstairs. Another old man named Chester had been living there, and Chester wasn't planning to leave. What started as two stubborn men fighting over a worthless house became something much deeper. But what was Chester hiding that would change everything Roy thought he knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in the Colorado Rockies carried the sharp bite of early autumn when Roy Baxter first laid eyes on what he'd purchased sight unseen from the county tax office. He pulled his battered pickup truck to a stop beside a mailbox that leaned at such an angle it seemed to be bowing in defeat. The house sat maybe 200 yards up a dirt path that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in a decade. Roy climbed out slowly, his joints protesting after the long drive from Denver. At 68, his body reminded him daily of every hard choice he'd made over the years. His worn leather pack sat in the passenger seat, containing everything he owned that mattered, which wasn't much. A few changes of clothes, a straight razor that had belonged to his father, some faded photographs he couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't throw away, and the deed to this godforsaken piece of mountain real estate. The house itself was a study in neglect and stubborn endurance. 2 stories of weathered pine logs, with a wraparound porch that sagged on the left side, where a support beam had given way. The roof showed patches of blue tarp, where shingles had surrendered to years of snow and wind. Paint peeled from the window frames like old skin, and the front steps looked like they might collapse if a man put his full weight on them wrong. But it was his now, for better or worse. $5 and the promise to pay back taxes when the county got around to calculating them. The seller had warned him it needed work, but Roy hadn't cared. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for a place to disappear. Roy shouldered his pack and walked the dirt path, noting how the weeds grew tall on either side. Abandoned, just like the paperwork had promised. He'd spent 40 years wandering from job to job, town to town, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. Construction work, mostly. Some ranch hand jobs when his back could still handle the heavy lifting. Always moving on when the memories caught up with him, when the guilt started whispering too loud in the quiet hours before dawn. This felt like the end of all that running. A place where a man could sit on a porch and watch the seasons change until his time was up. No neighbors to make small talk with, no one asking questions about where he'd been or why he'd come. Just the mountains and the silence and whatever peace he could make with himself in whatever years he had left. The front door hung slightly ajar, which struck him as odd. The realtor had mentioned the house had been empty for several years since the last owner died without heirs. Roy pushed the door open with his boot, listening to the hinges groan in protest. The interior smelled of wood smoke and something else, coffee, maybe, or tobacco. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that slanted through grimy windows. The main room was larger than he'd expected, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and a staircase leading to the second floor. Mismatched furniture sat, arranged as if someone had been living here recently. A wooden table near the kitchen held a tin coffee cup that looked freshly used. Roy set his pack down carefully, every sense suddenly alert. In Vietnam, that feeling had kept him alive more times than he could count. Something wasn't right here. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden floor above his head. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking from one room to another without any hurry at all. "Hello!" Roy called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Someone up there?" The footsteps stopped. Roy waited, listening to the silence stretch between heartbeats. Then a voice drifted down from upstairs, rough with age but carrying the authority of a man who wasn't easily intimidated. "Depends who's asking, I reckon." Roy looked around the room again, noting details he'd missed in his first assessment. The fireplace showed recent use, with ashes that couldn't be more than a day or two old. A pair of boots sat by the door, well worn but carefully maintained. This wasn't an abandoned house at all. "Name's Roy Baxter," he called back. "I bought this place from the county. Got the deed right here in my pack." A long pause, then the sound of footsteps again, this time heading toward what Roy assumed was the staircase. Moments later, an old black man appeared at the top of the stairs, moving with the careful dignity of someone whose body had seen hard years, but whose spirit remained unbroken. Chester Williams looked to be in his 80s, though the years had been kinder to him than they'd been to most men his age. His grey hair was neatly trimmed, his dark eyes sharp and assessing. He wore a flannel shirt that had seen many washings, but was clean and properly buttoned. In his right hand, he carried a walking stick, carved from what looked like mountain ash, its surface polished smooth by decades of use. "Chester Williams," the old man said, descending the stairs one careful step at a time. "And I've been taking care of this place since before you were born, I'd imagine." Roy watched Chester reach the bottom of the stairs and take his measure. There was no hostility in the old man's expression, but there was no welcome either. Just the patient assessment of someone who'd learned not to trust first impressions. "County says this place has been abandoned for years," Roy said, keeping his tone neutral. "Death taxes went unpaid, property got sold to cover them. I got the paperwork to prove it." Chester nodded slowly, as if he'd heard this story before and found it about as interesting as yesterday's weather. "County says a lot of things. Don't make them all true." He moved to the coffee pot that sat on the wood-burning stove in the kitchen area. "Coffee's fresh if you want some. Figured I might have company today." The casualness of the offer caught Roy off guard. He'd expected anger, demands that he leave, maybe even threats. Instead, Chester poured coffee into a second tin cup, as if entertaining unexpected visitors was something he did every day. "You knew I was coming?" Roy asked. "Saw your truck from the upstairs window about 10 minutes ago," Chester replied, handing Roy the steaming cup. "Took you long enough to work up the courage to come inside. Thought maybe you'd seen a ghost." Roy accepted the coffee, noting that Chester's hands were steady despite his age. The brew was strong and hot, exactly the way Roy preferred it. "You live here?" 23 years come December." Chester settled into a chair at the wooden table, gesturing for Roy to do the same. "Moved in after my Sarah passed. House was sitting empty then too, slowly falling apart. Figured it needed someone to look after it, and I needed somewhere quiet to think. But you don't own it. Neither do you, really." Chester's eyes held a hint of amusement. "Own the deed, maybe, but that's just paper. House belongs to whoever takes care of it. Land belongs to whoever understands it." Roy sat across from Chester, studying the old man's face for signs of deception or desperation. What he saw instead was a calm acceptance that suggested Chester had been expecting this conversation for a long time and wasn't particularly worried about its outcome. "I paid good money for this place," Roy said. $5. Chester chuckled, the sound carrying no mockery. "I heard about the auction. Figured somebody would show up eventually. Question is, what are you planning to do now that you're here?" Roy had expected this to be simple. Drive up, take possession, settle in to wait for whatever came next. The presence of Chester Williams complicated things in ways he hadn't prepared for. Looking around the room again, he could see evidence of care and maintenance everywhere. The windows might be grimy, but the frames had been recently repaired. The floorboards showed wear, but no rot. Someone had been keeping this place from falling down. "I came here to be left alone," Roy said finally. "Thought I'd found a place where nobody would bother me." "Plenty of room for two men to mind their own business," Chester replied. "House has 3 bedrooms upstairs, plus this main room. Property's got 47 acres, most of it timber. Man could live up here for years without seeing another soul, if that's what he wanted. You suggesting we share the place? I'm suggesting you drink your coffee before it gets cold and think about what you really came here for. Chester stood and walked to the window that faced east toward the mountains. Winter's coming early this year. Snow'll be flying in another month, maybe less. House needs work before then, if it's going to keep two old men warm through till spring. Roy found himself studying Chester's profile against the afternoon light. There was something in the way the old man carried himself, a dignity that spoke of education and accomplishment despite his current circumstances. This wasn't some vagrant who'd wandered into an empty house. Chester Williams belonged here in ways that Roy's $5 deed couldn't change. What kind of work? Roy asked. Chester turned from the window, and Roy caught a glimpse of something that might have been approval in his expression. Roof needs patching before the serious weather hits. Chimney needs cleaning. Been 3 years since I could get up there myself. Porch steps are about 2 storms away from collapsing completely. Kitchen pump needs new leather washers, and the root cellar door won't close proper anymore. Sounds like a lot for one man. Sounds like a winter's worth of work for 2 men who don't have anywhere else to be. Chester returned to his chair and regarded Roy with steady eyes. Question is whether you came here to die or whether you came here to live a little before you die. The words hit closer to home than Roy cared to admit. He'd been running so long he'd forgotten there might be any difference between the two. His leather pack sat by the door, containing everything he owned and nothing he truly valued. At 68, he was tired of carrying it. I'll think about it, Roy said, standing to leave. Your truck'll make it back to town before dark if you leave now, Chester said without any particular emphasis. Course, you could also bring your things in and take a look at what needs doing. Up to you. Roy paused at the door, looking back at Chester Williams sitting calmly at the kitchen table. The old man wasn't pushing, wasn't begging, wasn't making demands. He was simply presenting options, as if he'd learned long ago that most decisions made themselves if you gave them enough time and space. Outside, the afternoon shadows were growing longer across the mountains. Roy could drive back to town, find a motel, and figure out his next move. Or he could unload his pack and see what 23 years of Chester Williams' stewardship had really accomplished. When Roy returned 20 minutes later with his belongings, Chester was splitting kindling behind the house, working with the steady rhythm of a man who'd done this chore 10,000 times before. He didn't look up when Roy climbed the front steps, but Roy caught the slight nod of acknowledgement. Maybe this wouldn't be simple after all. But simple had never gotten Roy Baxter anywhere worth being. Roy spent his first night in the house, lying on a narrow cot in what Chester called the spare room, listening to the old building settle around him and the wind move through the pines outside. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the unfamiliar sounds of a place that had been home to someone else for over 2 decades. Every creak of the floorboards above suggested Chester moving around, though the old man seemed to walk with the consideration of someone who'd learned to share space quietly. Morning brought the smell of bacon and coffee drifting up from the kitchen. Roy dressed slowly, his body protesting the thin mattress and the altitude that made every breath feel like work. When he made his way downstairs, Chester was already seated at the table with a plate of eggs and biscuits, reading what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "Help yourself," Chester said without looking up, gesturing toward the stove where a pan of food waited. "Coffee's in the pot." Roy served himself and sat across from Chester, noting that the old man's breakfast looked like the work of someone who'd been cooking for himself for years. Practical, filling, and prepared with the efficiency that came from long practice. The biscuits were particularly good, with a texture that spoke of real skill rather than luck. "What's the map for?" Roy asked. Chester folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "Property lines. Been walking them every few months for 23 years, making sure the markers are still where they belong. Neighbors. Sometimes get confused about where their land ends and this place begins. You have neighbors, couple of families about 3 miles down the mountain. Good people, mostly. They know I've been taking care of this place." Chester's tone remained neutral, but Roy caught something underneath a quiet pride in the relationships he'd built over the years. Roy ate his breakfast in silence, considering the implications. Chester wasn't just a squatter who'd wandered into an empty house. He'd been integrated into whatever community existed in these mountains for more than 2 decades. He knew the land, knew the people, knew things that Roy's $5 deed couldn't teach him. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Roy said finally, "about the work that needs doing." "Have you now? I'm handy with repairs. Spent most of my working life in construction." Roy paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I need to understand something first. You say you've been taking care of this place for 23 years. What gives you the right?" Chester stood and walked to a wooden cabinet near the kitchen window. He opened it and withdrew a manila folder that looked like it had been handled frequently over the years. From the folder, he pulled out a collection of documents, some typed, some handwritten, all bearing the official seals and signatures that made them legal. "Property tax receipts," Chester said, laying them out on the table one by one. "Every year since 1998. Paid in full, on time, out of my own pocket." He added another stack of papers. "Maintenance records. Every repair, every improvement, every dollar spent keeping this place from falling down." Roy examined the documents, his understanding of the situation shifting with each piece of paper. The tax receipts alone represented thousands of dollars over more than 2 decades. The maintenance records showed work that went far beyond basic upkeep: new plumbing, electrical updates, roof repairs, foundation work. Chester Williams hadn't just been living here. He'd been investing in the place. "County never updated their records," Chester continued, returning to his chair. "Far as they're concerned, this place has been abandoned since the last owner died. But abandonment and ownership aren't the same thing, legally speaking. You're saying you own this place. I'm saying I've been acting as the owner for 23 years, and I've got the paperwork to prove it." Chester's voice carried no challenge, just statement of fact. "Question is what that means now that somebody else has bought a deed from the county." Roy studied Chester's weathered face, looking for signs of deception or desperation. What he found instead was the calm confidence of a man who'd been expecting this conversation for years and had prepared for it accordingly. The walking stick that leaned against Chester's chair caught his attention, not just a mobility aid, but a piece of craftsmanship. The wood was carved with intricate patterns that spoke of hours of patient work, and the handle was worn smooth by decades of use. "That stick," Roy said. "You make it yourself?" Chester glanced at the walking stick and nodded. "Mountain ash from right here on the property. Cut it the winter after Sarah died. Took me most of that year to carve it proper." He reached for the stick and ran his fingers along the carved surface. "Sarah always said I needed something to keep my hands busy when my mind got too quiet." The simple statement carried weight that Roy recognized. He'd spent enough years running from quiet minds to understand what Chester meant. "Your wife? 43 years. Lost her to cancer in 98. That's when I came up here." Chester set the stick back against his chair. "Couldn't stand being in town anymore, surrounded by memories. Thought I'd come up here and let the mountains take me when they were ready. But you stayed. House needed looking after. Land needed tending. Turned out I needed the work more than the mountains needed another old man's bones." Chester's expression softened slightly. "Sarah always said I was too stubborn to die easy." Roy found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about his situation. Chester Williams wasn't some vagrant or squatter. He was a widower who'd found purpose in preserving something that others had abandoned. The care evident in everything from the carved walking stick to the maintained property spoke of a man who built rather than destroyed, who created meaning from loss. "So what happens now?" Roy asked. "That depends on what you want to happen." Chester gathered his documents and returned them to their folder. "You've got a deed that says you own this place. I've got 23 years of tax receipts and maintenance records that say I've been acting as the owner. Lawyers could sort it out eventually, but that would take years and cost more than either of us probably has. You suggesting we go to court? I'm suggesting we're two old men who've both got better things to do than fight over paperwork. Chester stood and walked to the window again, his movements suggesting the conversation was approaching its crucial point. You came here looking for somewhere to be left alone. I've been here being left alone for over 20 years. Seems like we might be able to work something out. Roy felt the weight of Chester's proposal settling around him. This wasn't the simple retirement he'd imagined when he drove up the mountain yesterday. But looking around the kitchen, noting the careful repairs and thoughtful improvements Chester had made over the years, Roy had to admit the old man had earned something more than eviction. What kind of arrangement are you thinking about? Partnership, maybe. You've got legal title, I've got practical knowledge. You want somewhere quiet to live out your days. I want to keep this place from falling apart. Chester turned from the window, his dark eyes direct and honest. Winter's coming, whether we sort this out or not. House won't care who owns it if the roof caves in. Roy considered the proposal, thinking about the alternatives. He could insist on his legal rights, force Chester to leave, and spend his remaining years alone in a house he didn't understand, on land he'd never learned. Or he could accept that some things mattered more than ownership papers. What would Sarah say about taking in a stranger? Roy asked. Chester's face creased into what might have been a smile. Sarah always said there weren't any strangers, just people whose stories you hadn't heard yet. He picked up his walking stick and headed for the door. I'm going to walk the northern property line this morning. Check the markers before the weather turns. You're welcome to come along if you want to see what you bought. Roy watched Chester step onto the porch, noting how the old man tested each board before putting his full weight on it. The walking stick wasn't just decorative. Chester used it with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to compensate for limitations without letting them define him. Standing in the doorway, Roy looked out at the mountains that stretched away in every direction, their peaks already showing the first hint of snow that would soon transform this high country into something beautiful and dangerous. Chester was right about winter coming early, and he was right about the house needing work before the serious weather arrived. But more than that, Roy was beginning to understand that he might have found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Not just a place to disappear, but a chance to be useful again, to build instead of just endure. When Chester reached the tree line and turned to wave, Roy raised his hand in response. Then he went inside to gather his tools. The next 3 days fell into an uneasy rhythm that neither man acknowledged, but both seemed to accept. Chester rose before dawn, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and spent his mornings walking different sections of the property with the methodical thoroughness of someone conducting a survey. Roy worked on the porch steps, replacing rotted boards and reinforcing the support structure with lumber Chester had stockpiled in a shed behind the house. They ate meals together without much conversation, each man occupying his own space at the kitchen table while the October wind rattled the windows and reminded them both that winter wouldn't wait for them to sort out their differences. Chester read books, real books with cracked spines and margin notes that suggested multiple readings over many years. Roy studied the house itself, noting which repairs Chester had tackled and which he'd left for someone younger or stronger. The work felt good. Roy's hands remembered the weight of tools, the satisfaction of fixing something that was broken. The porch steps had been a genuine hazard when he'd arrived, ready to dump an unwary visitor onto the ground with potentially serious consequences. Now they were solid underfoot, properly braced and level. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. On Thursday morning, Roy discovered Chester sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet, breathing hard and holding his left shoulder. The old man's face was pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "What happened?" Roy asked, kneeling beside Chester and noting the way he favored his left side. "Nothing dramatic. just reached up to get something from the high shelf and felt something pop. Chester's voice was steady, but Roy could hear the pain underneath. Getting old isn't for the weak, I suppose. Roy helped Chester to his feet and into a chair, then retrieved the ice from the icebox and wrapped it in a dish towel. How long since you've seen a doctor? Couple of years. Don't trust them much. And they don't trust old men who live alone in the mountains. Chester accepted the ice pack with a grimace. I'll be fine in a day or two. Maybe, but you shouldn't be doing heavy work with that shoulder. Roy poured himself coffee and sat across from Chester. What were you reaching for anyway? Chester gestured toward the high cabinet with his good arm. Photo album. Thought you might like to see what this place looked like when I first got here. Roy retrieved the album from the high shelf, noting its weight and the careful way it had been preserved. The cover was brown leather, worn, soft with handling, and inside were dozens of photographs arranged chronologically. The earliest pictures showed the house in a state of serious disrepair, broken windows, a sagging roof, porch steps that had collapsed completely. This is how it looked in 1998? Roy asked, studying a photograph that showed the kitchen with holes in the floor and water damage staining the walls. Worse, actually. That picture was taken after I'd already started cleaning up. Chester turned pages with his good hand, revealing the slow transformation of the property over more than 2 decades. Previous owner died in the winter of '97. House sat empty for almost a year before I found it. The photographs told a story of patient, methodical restoration. Chester working on the roof, replacing shingles one section at a time. Chester rebuilding the porch, installing new windows, clearing years of accumulated debris from the interior. In many of the pictures, he was working alone, but occasionally other people appeared, neighbors, Roy assumed, lending a hand with projects too big for one man. But it was the photographs tucked between the later pages that stopped Roy cold. A small, faded image showed a much younger Chester Williams standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Both wore their Sunday best, and Chester's arm was around the woman's waist with the easy familiarity of long marriage. Sarah? Roy asked. Chester nodded, his expression softening. Taken at our church in town, maybe 1995. She was already getting sick by then, but you couldn't tell from looking at her. Sarah never let illness dim her light. Roy studied the photograph, noting the happiness in both faces and the obvious love between them. Behind them in the picture, he could see other people, family, friends, a community that had embraced them both. This wasn't just a picture of 2 people. It was evidence of a life fully lived, of connections that had mattered. She would have liked this place, Chester continued, carefully taking the photograph from Roy and holding it with his good hand. Always talked about getting a little cabin in the mountains where we could watch the seasons change. Never got the chance, though. Cancer moved too fast. I'm sorry, Roy said, and meant it. 27 years now. Some days it feels like yesterday, some days like another lifetime. Chester placed the photograph back in the album. Funny thing about loss, it doesn't get smaller, but you get stronger carrying it. Roy turned more pages, watching the house transform from ruin to refuge. Chester's documentation was thorough, showing not just the major repairs, but the small improvements that made a house into a home. Flower boxes installed under the windows, a vegetable garden carved out of what had been overgrown wilderness, paths cleared and maintained between the house and various outbuildings. You did all this yourself? Most of it. Neighbors helped with the big projects, new roof, foundation work, things that needed more than one pair of hands. Chester shifted in his chair, testing his shoulder gingerly. People up here look out for each other. Has to be that way when the nearest hospital is an hour's drive on good roads. The album revealed something else that Roy hadn't fully grasped before. Chester Williams wasn't just a man who'd stumbled onto an abandoned property. He was a craftsman, someone who understood construction and design and took pride in doing work the right way. The repairs shown in the photographs weren't quick fixes or temporary solutions. They were the kind of improvements that lasted. "Where'd you learn all this?" Roy asked, gesturing at a picture that showed Chester installing what appeared to be a complex electrical upgrade. 35 years as a maintenance supervisor at the paper mill in town, learned everything from plumbing to electrical work to basic engineering. Chester's tone carried quiet pride. "Retired in '96, figured I'd spend my golden years fishing and reading. Life had other plans." Roy closed the album carefully, understanding now why Chester's claim to the property carried such weight. This wasn't just about paying taxes or maintaining the place. It was about transformation, about taking something broken and making it whole again. Chester Williams had invested more than money in this house. He'd invested himself. "Shoulder feeling any better?" Roy asked. Chester tested his range of motion and winced. "I'll live, but I might need to take it easy for a few days." "Good thing you've got help now," Roy said, surprised to realize he meant it. "What needs doing that one man can handle?" Chester smiled, the first genuine smile Roy had seen from him. "Chimney needs cleaning before we start using the fireplace regular. Root cellar door's been sticking since the last big rain. And there's firewood that needs splitting before the weather turns. I can handle those things." "I believe you can," Chester said, and Roy caught something in his tone that might have been approval. Might be this arrangement will work out after all. Looking at the photo album one more time, Roy found himself thinking about the patience it must have taken to document 23 years of gradual improvement. Most men would have taken a few pictures and called it good, but Chester had created a record, a history that proved what one determined person could accomplish given enough time and dedication. Maybe there was something to be learned from that kind of patience. While Chester rested his injured shoulder, Roy threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised them both. The chimney cleaning revealed decades of creosote buildup that could have burned the house down come winter. The root cellar door required not just adjustment, but complete rehinging, a job that took most of a day but resulted in a seal tight enough to keep the stored vegetables from freezing. It was while splitting firewood behind the house that Chester discovered Roy's military background. Roy had stripped down to a t-shirt despite the cool October air, and the dog tags hanging from his neck caught the afternoon sunlight. Chester watched from the kitchen window as Roy worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for the long haul, splitting each log with precise strikes that wasted no motion. When Roy came inside for water, Chester was sitting at the table with 2 glasses already poured. "Army?" Chester asked, nodding toward the dog tags. Roy's hand moved instinctively to his chest, covering the tags. "Marines, long time ago. Vietnam, 2 tours, 69 to 71. Roy drank deeply, avoiding Chester's eyes. "Not something I talk about much. Most men who were there don't," Chester replied. "My nephew Jimmy served 3 tours, came back different than when he left. Took him years to find his way back to himself." Roy set down his glass and looked at Chester directly for the first time since the subject had come up. "What happened to him?" "Your nephew. Lives in Montana now. Married a good woman, raised 3 kids, teaches high school shop class." Chester's tone carried quiet pride. "Turns out sometimes the best way to heal from breaking things is to spend your life fixing them." The observation hung in the air between them while Roy considered its implications. He'd spent 40 years running from what he'd done and seen in Vietnam, never staying anywhere long enough to build anything that mattered. Maybe Chester's nephew had found something Roy had been too afraid to look for. "What branch were you?" Roy asked. "Navy. Korea, mostly ship duty. Different kind of war, but war all the same." Chester stood and moved to the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the property. "Lost some good friends over there. Spent a lot of years wondering why I came home when better men didn't." "You find an answer?" "Sarah did. She said, maybe I came home so I could take care of something that needed taking care of." Chester turned from the window. "Took me most of a lifetime to understand what she meant, but I think I'm starting to get it." That evening, they shared their first real conversation over dinner. Chester cooked venison steaks from a deer he'd taken the previous fall, preparing them with wild mushrooms he'd gathered that morning and herbs from a garden Roy was just beginning to notice. The meal was better than anything Roy had eaten in months, prepared with the skill of someone who'd learned to make the most of what the mountains provided. "You hunt much?" Roy asked. "Enough to keep meat on the table. State allows 1 deer a year for residents over 65, and I've got permission from the neighbors to hunt their land if needed." Chester cut his steak carefully, favoring his injured shoulder. "Never take more than I can use. Sarah taught me that she said the land gives what you need if you don't get greedy." Roy found himself thinking about Sarah Williams more than he'd expected. From Chester's stories and the photographs in the album, she emerged as someone who'd understood how to live well, not extravagantly, but with purpose and connection. It was clear that Chester's approach to everything from cooking to property maintenance had been shaped by her wisdom. "She sounds like she was something special," Roy said. 43 years I knew her, and she surprised me every day." Chester's expression softened with memory. "Met her at a church social in 1954. I was 22, cocky as they come, figured I knew everything worth knowing. Sarah was 19 and had more sense in her little finger than I had in my whole body. Love at first sight, mutual annoyance at first sight. She thought I was too full of myself, and I thought she was too serious about everything." Chester chuckled. "Took 6 months of arguing before either of us admitted we might be wrong." Roy smiled despite himself. "What changed?" "I started listening to what she was actually saying, instead of waiting for my turn to talk. Turned out she was usually right about things that mattered." Chester paused, lost in memory. Sarah had a way of seeing what was really important. She'd say, "Chester Williams, you can spend your whole life being right, or you can spend it being happy, but you probably can't do both." The story resonated with Roy in ways he hadn't expected. He'd spent decades being right about the futility of getting close to people, right about the danger of staying in one place too long, right about the inevitability of disappointment and loss. But being right had cost him any chance of being happy. "Why'd you never remarry?" Roy asked. "Who says I never thought about it?" Chester's eyes twinkled with humor. "Had a few ladies try to domesticate me over the years, but none of them understood what this place meant to me. They wanted me to sell it, move back to town, live in some little apartment where we could play cards and complain about our aches and pains. And that didn't appeal to you. This house, this land, it's the last thing Sarah and I planned together. We talked about it for years before she got sick. She made me promise I'd find our mountain cabin and take care of it properly." Chester's voice grew quiet. "Couldn't abandon that promise just because I got lonely." After dinner, Roy helped Chester organize the tools in the workshop behind the house, learning the careful system the old man had developed over the years. Everything had its place, and everything was maintained with the obsessive care of someone who understood that good tools were the foundation of good work. It was there, among the carefully arranged hammers and saws and measuring instruments, that Chester showed Roy the collection of walking sticks he'd carved over the years. Dozens of them, each unique, crafted from different types of wood and featuring intricate patterns that spoke of countless hours of patient work. "Gives me something to do with my hands when the weather's too bad for outside work," Chester explained, running his fingers along a stick carved from cherry wood. "Sarah always said idle hands were the devil's workshop." Roy picked up one of the sticks, noting its perfect balance and the smoothness of wood polished by years of handling. "These are beautiful. You ever sell any?" "Give them to people who need them. Neighbors, mostly, or folks in town who've had hip surgery or knee replacements." Chester selected his favorite stick, the mountain ash piece he carried daily. "Figure, if I've got the skill and the time, might as well use both for something useful." Standing in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had occupied Chester's hands and mind for over 2 decades, Roy felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, not just to a place, but to a purpose. Chester Williams had built more than just a home here. He'd built a life worth living. October slipped into November with the kind of gradual intensity that mountain weather was known for. The aspens had turned gold and dropped their leaves, leaving the slopes looking like they'd been dusted with coins. Morning frost lingered later each day, and the afternoon shadows grew longer and sharper. Roy found himself checking the sky constantly, reading signs that Chester had taught him to watch for. "Storm coming," Chester announced one morning, standing at the kitchen window with his coffee and studying the clouds that hung low over the western peaks. "Big one, judging by how the birds are acting." Roy looked up from the journal he'd been reading, one of Chester's handwritten notebooks that documented 23 years of weather patterns, seasonal changes, and wildlife observations. The detail was extraordinary, recorded with the precision of someone who understood that survival in the mountains often depended on paying attention to things that city folks might dismiss as trivia. "Says here you had an early blizzard in '03 that lasted 4 days, Roy said, tapping the relevant entry. "October 28th, worst storm I've seen up here. Lost power for a week, couldn't get down to town for supplies." Chester's expression grew thoughtful. "That's when I learned the importance of being ready for anything. Sarah always said, preparation was just another word for love, taking care of yourself so you could take care of others." Roy had been reading Chester's journals for the past week, fascinated by the depth of observation they contained. These weren't just weather records. They were a complete natural history of 47 acres of Colorado mountain country, written by someone who'd learned to see patterns that most people missed. Migration timing, plant flowering schedules, the relationship between temperature and precipitation. It was all there, recorded in Chester's careful handwriting. "You ever think about getting these published?" Roy asked, holding up the journal. "This is real science." "Published?" Chester chuckled. "Who'd want to read about an old man watching the weather? Farmers, hunters, anyone who needs to understand how mountain weather actually works." Roy flipped through pages filled with detailed observations and hand-drawn charts. "This isn't just watching the weather, this is understanding it." Chester returned to his coffee, but Roy caught a hint of pleasure in his expression. It was clear that the journals represented something important to Chester, a way of making sense of his world, of finding patterns and meaning in the natural cycles that governed life at altitude. The storm Chester had predicted arrived that afternoon with the sudden violence that characterized mountain weather. Roy was splitting firewood when the first snowflakes began to fall. Fat and lazy at first, then driven horizontal by winds that seemed to come from every direction at once. Within an hour, the visibility had dropped to maybe 50 yards, and the temperature had fallen 20 degrees. Inside the house, Chester moved with the calm efficiency of someone who'd weathered dozens of similar storms. He lit the oil lamps, checked the water supply, and made sure the firewood stack beside the stove was fully loaded. Roy watched the preparations with growing respect for Chester's methodical approach to mountain living. "Power'll go out soon," Chester said, as if discussing the weather rather than predicting a potential emergency. "Always does, when the wind gets this strong. Trees fall across the lines, and the power company won't send crews up here until the storm passes." As if summoned by Chester's prediction, the lights flickered and died. But instead of the darkness Roy had expected, the house glowed with warm lamplight that made the storm outside seem distant and manageable. Chester had prepared for this moment, and his preparations extended far beyond simply having oil lamps available. "How long do these storms usually last?" Roy asked. "This one? Maybe 2 days, possibly 3. Chester settled into his chair by the fireplace with one of his journals and a pencil. "Long enough to catch up on my notes and get to know each other better." Roy found himself oddly comfortable with the prospect of being snowed in. The house felt solid around them, insulated from the storm's fury by thick log walls and Chester's careful maintenance over the years. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the room with the pleasant scent of burning pine. "What do you write in those journals during storms?" Roy asked. Storm observations mostly, wind direction, temperature changes, snow accumulation. Chester looked up from his writing, but also thoughts. Things I notice about how the place changes when the weather gets serious. Roy moved to the window and peered out through the frost-etched glass. The world beyond had vanished into a swirl of white that seemed to erase everything familiar. It was both beautiful and slightly terrifying, a reminder of how quickly the mountains could isolate a person from the rest of civilization. "Ever get scared up here alone?" Roy asked. Chester considered the question seriously. Scared? Not exactly. Respectful? Definitely. The mountains don't care about your plans or your schedule. They'll teach you humility whether you want to learn it or not. What about loneliness? That's different. Loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about feeling disconnected from something that matters. Chester gestured around the room with his pencil. Hard to feel disconnected when you're surrounded by everything you've built and cared for. The insight resonated with Roy more than he'd expected. He'd been alone for most of 40 years, but he'd rarely felt as lonely as he had in crowded places where he didn't belong. Here, snowed in with Chester Williams while a mountain storm raged outside, he felt more connected to something real than he had in decades. "Tell me about building this place up," Roy said, settling into the chair across from Chester. "Not just the repairs, the whole process." Chester smiled and set aside his journal. "That's a long story. We've got time." "Well, I suppose we do at that." Chester reached for another piece of wood and added it to the fire. Started with just trying to make the place livable, but Sarah had always talked about having a home that worked with the land instead of fighting against it. So everything I did, I asked myself, what would Sarah think of this? Over the next several hours, while the storm howled outside and the fire burned low and was rebuilt, Chester told Roy about the transformation of the property. Not just the physical work, but the thinking behind it. How he'd positioned the vegetable garden to take advantage of morning sun and afternoon shade. How he'd cleared drainage around the foundation to prevent water damage. How he'd planted native trees and shrubs that would provide food for wildlife while requiring minimal maintenance. Took me about 10 years to understand that I wasn't just fixing up an old house, Chester said as the evening wore on. I was creating something Sarah and I had dreamed about but never got to build together. Roy listened to the stories with growing appreciation for the depth of thought that had gone into every aspect of the property's development. This wasn't just maintenance or even restoration. It was creation, the patient work of turning a vision into reality, one project at a time, over more than 2 decades. When they finally went to bed, the storm was still raging outside, but the house felt like the most secure place on earth. The storm lasted 3 days, just as Chester had predicted. By the second morning, the snow had piled 4 feet deep against the north side of the house, and the wind had sculpted drifts that reached nearly to the eaves. Roy woke to the sound of Chester moving carefully around the kitchen, starting coffee and checking the fire with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to conserve energy during long sieges of weather. "Power's still out," Chester reported when Roy made his way downstairs. "Could be another day or 2 before they get the lines fixed. Good thing we've got plenty of firewood and the hand pump still works." Roy poured himself coffee and stood at the window, marveling at the transformed landscape. The familiar contours of the property had disappeared under smooth white curves that made everything look alien and beautiful. Only the tallest fence posts and the tops of the pine trees marked where the known world continued under its winter disguise. "Ever been snowed in this long before?" Roy asked. "Once or twice. Winter of '05 was worse. Storm lasted 5 days, and the temperature never got above 0. Chester settled at the kitchen table with a tin box Roy hadn't seen before. "That's when I started keeping better records of what worked and what didn't." Chester opened the box to reveal a collection of medals and decorations that took Roy by surprise. A purple heart, a bronze star, several commendation ribbons, and other awards that spoke of distinguished naval service. Roy recognized some of them from his own military experience, understanding immediately what they represented. "You never mentioned these," Roy said. "Don't usually show them to people. But being stuck inside with a fellow veteran seems like the right time." Chester picked up the Purple Heart, turning it over in his weathered hands. "Got this one in Korea. Shrapnel from a mortar round that should have killed me, but only carved up my back instead." Roy studied the medals with the respect they deserved. These weren't just decorations. They were evidence of courage under fire, of service that had cost something real. "What ship?" "USS Helena. Cruiser. We provided fire support for the Marines during some of the worst fighting." Chester's expression grew distant. "Lost a lot of good sailors over there. Boys who never made it home to their families." "Bronze Star. Action near Wonsan. Our gun crew kept firing even after we took hits that should have put us out of commission." Chester set the medal aside carefully. "Funny thing about courage, you never know you have it until you need it." Roy understood exactly what Chester meant. In Vietnam, he'd discovered reserves of determination and endurance that he'd never known existed. But he'd also discovered a capacity for violence and destruction that had haunted him ever since. "You ever have trouble afterward, coming back to civilian life?" Roy asked. "Some. Sarah helped with that." Chester's voice softened. "She had a way of reminding me who I was before the war, and who I could be after it. Said the war was something that happened to me, not something that defined me." "Smart woman. Smartest person I ever knew. And patient. Took her 2 years to convince me that I deserved to be happy." Chester closed the medal box carefully. "What about you? How long did it take you to come home from Vietnam?" The question hit Roy harder than he'd expected. He'd been physically back from Vietnam for over 40 years, but the honest answer was that he'd never really come home at all. He'd spent decades running from the memories, the guilt, the dreams that still woke him in the middle of the night. "Still working on that," Roy admitted. Chester nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "War's like that sometimes. Some men come home quick, some take longer, and some never quite make it all the way back." They spent the rest of the morning sharing stories, not the dramatic ones that made good movies, but the small, human moments that revealed what war really cost. Chester talked about letters from home that arrived months late, about shipmates who volunteered for dangerous assignments because sitting still was harder than staying busy. Roy found himself describing the weight of a rifle after 16 hours of patrol, the taste of water purification tablets, the way jungle rot made your feet feel like they belonged to someone else. "Strangest thing about combat," Chester said, "is how ordinary it becomes. First time you're under fire, you think you're going to die. By the 100th time, you're thinking about what you want for dinner, or whether you remembered to write to your mother," Roy added, "or why your left boot keeps coming untied no matter how tight you tie it." They were still talking when the sound of an engine broke through the storm's diminished roar. Chester moved to the window and peered out through the blowing snow. "That'll be Tommy Rodriguez with his plow truck. Lives about 5 miles down the mountain. Always checks on me after big storms." Roy watched as a massive pickup truck with a plow blade fought its way up the driveway, pushing through snow that came up to its headlights. The truck stopped near the house, and a man in his 40s climbed out, waving at the window where Chester stood. "Tommy's good people," Chester said, pulling on his coat. "Lost his father in Iraq a few years back. Looks after the older folks up here like it's his personal responsibility." Roy followed Chester. Outside, noting how the younger man's face lit up when he saw that Chester wasn't alone. Tommy Rodriguez had the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors year-round, but his smile was genuine and his handshake firm when Chester introduced Roy. "Glad to meet you, Mr. Baxter. Chester's been up here by himself too long." Tommy's accent carried just a hint of Spanish, and his manner suggested the kind of casual respect that came from genuine affection. "You guys need anything from town? I'm making supply runs for anyone who's snowed in. We're fine, Chester replied. Plenty of food, heat's working, and we've got good company for conversation. Tommy grinned. Good company's the most important thing. Gets lonely up here when the weather turns mean. He gestured toward the house. Place looks good, Chester. You've been keeping busy. Roy here's been helping with some of the heavier work. Man knows his way around tools. Roy found himself oddly pleased by Chester's casual endorsement. It had been years since anyone had spoken of him as part of a team, as someone who contributed rather than just passed through. After Tommy left, promising to check back in a few days, Roy and Chester returned to the warmth of the house. The brief interaction with their neighbor had reminded Roy of something he'd almost forgotten: the way community was supposed to work, with people looking out for each other, not from obligation, but from genuine care. Nice guy, Roy said. Best kind of neighbor. Helps when you need it. Minds his own business otherwise. Chester poured fresh coffee and settled back at the table. Sarah always said you could judge a place by the quality of people who chose to live there. Roy thought about the places he'd lived over the years: temporary rooms, anonymous apartments, spaces he'd occupied but never inhabited. None of them had offered the kind of community he'd just witnessed, the sense that someone might notice and care if he disappeared. Maybe it was time to stop running long enough to find out what he'd been missing. The snow began melting on the fourth day, revealing a world transformed by winter's first serious assault. Roy spent the morning clearing paths between the house and the various outbuildings, while Chester worked inside, organizing papers with an intensity that seemed driven by more than simple housekeeping. When Roy came in for lunch, he found Chester seated at the kitchen table with documents spread around him, like pieces of a puzzle he was trying to solve. Legal papers? Roy asked, noting the official seals and formal language visible on several of the documents. Something like that. Chester's tone carried an edge Roy hadn't heard before. Been putting off dealing with these for too long. Storm gave me time to think, and I've decided it's time you knew the whole story. Roy poured himself coffee and sat across from Chester, noting the careful way the old man had arranged the documents. Whatever this was about, Chester had been preparing for this conversation longer than the 3 days they'd been snowed in together. Remember when I showed you those tax receipts? Chester began, selecting a thick manila envelope from the pile. What I didn't tell you was why I started paying them in the first place. Chester opened the envelope and withdrew a document that looked much older than the others, yellowed paper with elaborate script and official seals that spoke of 19th century legal formality. Roy recognized it immediately as a land grant, the kind of document that established original ownership of frontier property. This is a homestead patent, Chester said, handling the document with reverent care. Issued in 1887 to Ezekiel Williams, my great-grandfather. Roy studied the document, reading the formal language that granted Ezekiel Williams ownership of 47 acres in what was then Colorado Territory. The description matched exactly with the property where they now sat, down to the creek boundaries and the distinctive rock formations that marked the northern border. Your family owned this land originally. Owned it, worked it, lived on it for over 60 years. Chester's voice carried a weight of history that Roy was just beginning to understand. Ezekiel built the first cabin on this site in 1888. His son Marcus expanded it in the 1,920 seconds, added the second story and most of the foundation work that's still solid today. Chester spread out additional documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property transfers that traced an unbroken line of Williams family ownership from 1,887 through the 1,940 seconds. Roy found himself looking at the documentary evidence of a family's deep roots in this particular piece of Colorado mountain country. What happened? How did your family lose the land? Chester's expression hardened with old anger that time hadn't completely dulled. 1,951. My father Marcus had been struggling since the war ended. Work was scarce, money was tight, and he'd fallen behind on property taxes. Not unusual for folks up here. Most families went through rough patches. Chester pulled out a stack of correspondence between Marcus Williams and various county officials. Roy could see the desperation in the increasingly formal language as Marcus tried to work out payment arrangements and extensions. County gave him until December to catch up. Marcus scraped together most of what he owed, but came up about $300 short. Chester's hands trembled slightly as he handled the papers. $300. In today's money, maybe $3,000. That's what it cost my family to lose everything they'd built over 2 generations. The county foreclosed for $300? Worse than that. County sold the property to a local businessman for the amount of back taxes owed. Marcus wasn't even notified about the sale until after it happened. Chester's voice carried decades of suppressed rage. Found out when the new owner showed up with a sheriff's deputy to evict my parents from the house they'd been born in. Roy studied the foreclosure documents, noting the dates and the legal language that had stripped the Williams family of their heritage. The process appeared to be technically legal, but it stank of the kind of manipulation that had been all too common in that era. Who bought it? Man named Harrison Caldwell. Owned most of the profitable businesses in town, including the bank that held my father's debt. Chester's laugh carried no humor. Funny how that worked out. Caldwell arranged for my father to borrow money against the property, then bought the property when my father couldn't pay back the loan. That's not legal. Wasn't legal then either. But proving it would have taken lawyers my family couldn't afford. So Caldwell got 47 acres of prime mountain property for $300, and my parents got evicted from the only home they'd ever known. Roy felt a cold understanding settling in his stomach. And Caldwell was the previous owner, the one who died and left the property to be sold for taxes. Harrison Caldwell Jr., actually, inherited the property from his father and never set foot on it. Let it sit empty for decades while he lived in Denver, collecting rental income from other properties his father had acquired the same way. Chester gathered the documents into neat stacks. Junior died in 1997 without heirs, and the property reverted to the county for unpaid taxes. Full circle, you might say. The implications hit Roy like a physical blow. His $5 purchase hadn't been a simple acquisition of abandoned property. He'd unknowingly participated in the final act of a 60-year-old theft, buying land that should never have been for sale in the first place. That's why you came up here in 1998, Roy said. After Sarah died, you came home. Figured somebody ought to take care of the place properly. My great-grandfather cleared this land with his bare hands. My grandfather built the original cabin. My father expanded it into a real homestead. Chester's voice grew quiet. Seemed like the least I could do was make sure it didn't fall down from neglect. And you've been paying the taxes ever since? Every year, full amount, on time, with documentation. Chester tapped the stack of tax receipts. Been building a legal case for adverse possession. 23 years of continuous occupation, maintenance, and tax payments. Under Colorado law, that's enough to establish legal ownership regardless of who holds the deed. Roy stared at the documents spread across the table, finally understanding the full complexity of his situation. Chester Williams wasn't just a squatter who'd been living in an abandoned house. He was the rightful heir to stolen property, patiently working to reclaim his family's heritage through the only legal means available to him. Why? Didn't you tell me this from the beginning? Roy asked. Because I wanted to see what kind of man you were first. Plenty of folks would hear this story and figure they could make a profit, somehow sell the deed back to me for more than they paid, or threaten legal action to force me off the property. Chester met Roy's eyes directly. But watching you work these past weeks, seeing how you treat the place and how you listen to its history, I think you might understand that some things matter more than money. Roy looked around the kitchen. seeing it now not just as Chester's home, but as the latest incarnation of a dwelling that had sheltered the Williams family for over a century. The careful repairs and improvements Chester had made weren't just maintenance. They were acts of love, efforts to preserve something that should never have been lost. "What happens now?" Roy asked. "That depends on you." Chester straightened the documents one final time. "You've got legal title to property that was stolen from my family 60 years ago. I've got moral right to land that's been in my family for over a century, plus 23 years of documentation that might hold up in court. You want to sue me? I want to do what's right. Question is, what do you think that looks like?" Roy stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered property that had taken on an entirely different meaning in the space of a conversation. This wasn't just real estate anymore. It was a family's stolen heritage, a wrong that had been waiting 60 years for someone to make it right. When he turned back to Chester, Roy had made his decision. Roy spent the next week in a state of quiet turmoil that he tried to hide from Chester, but suspected the old man saw through anyway. The revelation about the property's history had shifted everything Roy thought he understood about his situation. What had seemed like a simple real estate transaction now felt like participation in an injustice that stretched back decades. He threw himself into research with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that had personal stakes. The county courthouse in town became his second home as he dug through property records, tax assessments, and legal filings that told the story of how the Williams family had lost their land. What he discovered made his stomach turn. Harrison Caldwell Sr. had been even more calculating than Chester had suggested. The records showed a pattern of predatory lending targeting struggling mountain families throughout the 1940s and early 1950s. Caldwell would extend loans secured by property, then use his influence at the bank and courthouse to ensure that payment schedules were impossible to meet. When families inevitably defaulted, Caldwell would acquire their land for pennies on the dollar through foreclosure sales he essentially controlled. The Williams family had been just one of at least a dozen families victimized by Caldwell's scheme. Roy found records of similar transactions, homesteads lost for trivial amounts of back taxes, family properties sold to Caldwell's associates for a fraction of their value, legal challenges that mysteriously disappeared from court dockets. But the Williams case was different in one crucial respect. Unlike the other families who'd been forced to leave the area entirely, Chester had found a way to come home. His 23 years of documented occupation, maintenance, and tax payments created a legal foundation that might actually hold up in court. Roy spread the documents across his motel room bed, constructing a timeline that painted a clear picture of systematic theft disguised as legal proceedings. The evidence was damning, but proving it in court would require lawyers and litigation that could drag on for years. There had to be a simpler way to make this right. That's when Roy discovered the quit-claim deed form in the courthouse's self-help legal section. He studied the simple document that would allow him to transfer all rights and interest in the property to Chester Williams without requiring extensive legal proceedings. It wasn't complicated, just a matter of stating clearly that Roy Baxter was transferring his ownership interest in the described property to Chester Williams, with signatures notarized and the document filed with the county. But signing the deed would mean giving up the last thing Roy owned, the final refuge he'd purchased for his remaining years. At 68, with no family and no other assets, signing over the property would leave him essentially homeless. The practical implications were sobering. Roy sat in his motel room that night, studying the blank quitclaim deed and considering his options. He could keep the property and offer Chester some kind of rental arrangement, but that would still leave the fundamental injustice unresolved. He could sell the property back to Chester for what he'd paid $5 plus back taxes, but Chester had already indicated he'd spent most of his savings on maintaining the place over the years. Or he could do what Sarah Williams would probably have done, and make the choice that served justice rather than self-interest. Roy filled out the quitclaim deed carefully, transferring ownership from himself to Chester Williams for the consideration of $1 and other good and valuable consideration. The language was formal and legal, but the meaning was simple. Roy was giving Chester back his family's land. The next step was more complicated. Roy needed Chester to understand that this wasn't charity or pity, but recognition of a wrong that needed correcting. More importantly, he needed Chester to accept the transfer without feeling obligated to provide Roy with anything in return. When Roy returned to the mountain house the following morning, Chester was splitting firewood behind the workshop with the steady rhythm of someone who'd done this chore thousands of times. He looked up when Roy's truck pulled into the yard, but didn't stop working until he'd finished the log he was splitting. "Find what you were looking for in town?" Chester asked, setting aside his splitting maul and wiping sweat from his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "More than I was looking for, actually." Roy pulled the manila envelope from his truck and handed it to Chester. "Thought you might want to see what I found about Caldwell's other business dealings." Chester opened the envelope and studied the documents. Roy had copied the evidence of Caldwell's systematic targeting of mountain families throughout the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds. His expression grew grim as he read through the records of families destroyed by predatory lending and legal manipulation. "Worse than I thought," Chester said finally. "My father always said Caldwell was crooked, but I figured that was just bitterness talking." "Your father was right. Caldwell stole a lot more than just your family's land." Roy hesitated, then continued. "But your case is different from the others. You've got documentation that might actually hold up in court." Chester nodded slowly, understanding where the conversation was heading. "Might doesn't mean it would, or that I could afford the legal fees it would take to find out." "That's what I figured you'd say." Roy pulled the second envelope from his truck, the one containing the completed quitclaim deed. "So, I found a simpler solution." Chester opened the second envelope and stared at the deed for a long moment, reading it twice before looking back at Roy, with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been suspicion. "What's this about, Roy?" "It's about doing what's right. That land was stolen from your family 60 years ago. You've spent 23 years taking care of it, improving it, and paying taxes on it." Roy met Chester's eyes directly. "It belongs to you, and this makes it legal." Chester set the deed aside carefully, as if it might explode if handled roughly. "You're talking about giving me property worth maybe $50,000. Why would you do that?" "Because $50,000 isn't worth as much as sleeping at night without feeling like a thief." Roy gestured toward the house. "Besides, what am I going to do with this place without you? I don't know the first thing about living up here. Hell, I didn't even know a storm was coming until you told me. You could sell it to someone else. To another stranger who doesn't understand what this place means. Someone who might tear down everything you've built and turn it into some kind of vacation cabin." Roy shook his head. "That would be worse than what Caldwell did." Chester picked up the deed again, studying Roy's signature with the attention of someone who understood the magnitude of what was being offered. "This isn't charity, is it? You're not doing this because you feel sorry for an old black man who got cheated. This is about justice, about making right something that should never have been wrong in the first place." Roy's voice grew quiet. "Besides, I've got something to ask you in return." Chester's expression sharpened. "What's that?" "Let me stay, not as an owner or a tenant, but as a partner. Someone who helps maintain the place and earns his keep." Roy paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been running for 40 years, Chester. From Vietnam, from memories, from the possibility of caring about anything enough to get hurt again. I'm tired of running." Chester was quiet for so long that Roy began to wonder if he'd overstepped some boundary he didn't understand. The old man stood holding the deed, looking out at the property his family had built and lost and reclaimed, weighing an offer that was probably more complicated than Roy realized. Partnership, Chester said finally. Equal partners, equal say in how things get done. Equal partners. And when one of us dies, the survivor keeps the place and maintains it properly. Agreed. Chester folded the deed and slipped it back into its envelope. I'll need to think about this. Decision this big shouldn't be made quick. Take all the time you need, but while you're thinking, there's something else you should consider. Roy gestured toward the house. Sarah's dream wasn't just about you having a place in the mountains. It was about having a place where you belonged, where you weren't alone. Chester's eyes widened slightly, as if Roy had touched on something he'd been thinking but hadn't articulated. Maybe she knew you'd need more than just land to be happy, Roy continued. Maybe she knew you'd need family, even if it wasn't the family you were born into. Chester walked to the edge of the yard, where he could see the entire property spread out below them. The house he'd rebuilt, the gardens he'd planted, the workshop where he'd carved walking sticks for neighbors who needed them. 23 years of patient work had transformed a neglected property into something that honored the memory of the family who'd originally made it home. All right, Chester said, turning back to Roy. Partners it is, but we do this legal and proper. Lawyer, witnesses, documents filed correctly. Whatever you think is right. Chester extended his hand, and Roy shook it, feeling the calluses and strength that spoke of decades of honest work. It was a handshake that sealed more than a business agreement. It was a promise between two men who'd found something they'd been looking for, without quite knowing they'd been searching for it. Welcome home, Roy Baxter, Chester said. For the first time in 40 years, Roy believed he actually was home. The lawyer's office in town smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, with the kind of quiet dignity that came from decades of helping mountain families navigate life's legal complications. Margaret Sutter had been practicing law in these mountains for 30 years, and her reputation for fairness and plain speaking had made her the go-to attorney for folks who wanted honest advice without fancy complications. Roy sat beside Chester in the worn leather chairs facing Margaret's desk while she reviewed the documents they'd brought Chester's original family land grant. The foreclosure papers from 1951, Roy's recent purchase deed, and the quitclaim transfer Roy had prepared. The morning sun slanted through tall windows, casting patterns on the wall that reminded Roy of light filtering through forest canopy. This is quite a story, Margaret said finally, removing her reading glasses and setting them aside. Mr. Williams, your family was definitely wronged 60 years ago. The foreclosure proceedings show clear evidence of manipulation, though proving it in court today would be challenging. Chester nodded, his hands resting on his carved walking stick. I figured as much. Too much time passed, too many records lost or destroyed. However, Margaret continued, your 23 years of documented occupation, maintenance and tax payments create a strong adverse possession claim. Colorado law recognizes that someone who openly and continuously occupies property for 18 years or more, while paying taxes and maintaining it, can establish legal ownership regardless of who holds the deed. Roy felt a surge of satisfaction. Chester's patient stewardship hadn't just been about preserving his family's heritage, it had been building a legal foundation for reclaiming it. So Chester could sue to establish ownership? Roy asked. He could, but it would take time and money, with no guarantee of success. Litigation is always uncertain. Margaret picked up the quitclaim deed Roy had prepared. This approach is much cleaner. Mr. Baxter, you're voluntarily transferring your interest in the property to Mr. Williams. With proper notarization and recording, this deed will establish clear title. Chester turned to Roy, his expression serious. You're certain about this? Once we sign these papers and file them, there's no taking it back. Roy had spent 3 sleepless nights considering exactly that question. Giving up the property meant giving up the only asset he owned, the only security he had for whatever years remained to him. But keeping it would mean living with the knowledge that his security came from someone else's stolen heritage. "I'm certain," Roy said. "This land belongs to your family. It's time it came home." Margaret witnessed their signatures and applied her notary seal with the ceremonial care that such moments deserved. The transfer document, that had been just paper and possibility when Roy first drafted it, was now a legal instrument that would restore the Williams family ownership of the land they'd worked for over 60 years. "There is one more thing," Margaret said, pulling a fresh document from her desk drawer. "Mr. Williams asked me to prepare a partnership agreement. If you're both agreeable to the terms, this will formalize your arrangement as equal partners in maintaining and improving the property." Roy looked at Chester in surprise. "You had this drawn up before we came here?" Seemed like the smart thing to do. Partnership this important ought to be based on more than just a handshake and good intentions. Chester's expression carried the hint of a smile. "Besides, Sarah always said any deal that mattered was worth putting in writing." Roy read through the partnership agreement, noting its fairness and simplicity. Both men would have equal say in decisions affecting the property. Both would contribute to maintenance and improvements according to their abilities. If either partner died, the survivor would inherit full ownership with the understanding that the property would be maintained according to the principles they'd established together. "This gives me ownership interest even though I'm not paying anything for it," Roy pointed out. "You're paying with 40 years of construction experience and a willingness to do the work this place needs," Chester replied. "That's worth more than money to me." Margaret reviewed the partnership agreement one more time, then had both men sign and initial each page. When the paperwork was complete, she gathered everything into a file folder and stood to shake their hands. "Congratulations, gentlemen. You now officially own 47 acres of some of the prettiest mountain property in Colorado." She handed Chester the deed and Roy a copy of the partnership agreement. "Take good care of it." Outside the lawyer's office, Roy and Chester stood in the town square, looking up at the mountains that rose around them like protective walls. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of visibility that made distant peaks look close enough to touch. "How does it feel?" Roy asked. "Having your family's land back after 60 years? Chester was quiet for a long moment, studying the deed that made his ownership official. When he looked up, Roy saw something in his expression that might have been peace. "Feels like Sarah was right about something she told me a long time ago," Chester said. "She said justice might be slow, but it's also patient. Sometimes it just waits for the right people to show up and do what's right." Roy found himself thinking about the path that had brought him here, decades of wandering, guilt that had driven him from place to place, and finally the desperate decision to buy a $5 house where he could disappear from the world. If someone had told him 6 months ago that he'd end up as a partner in a mountain homestead with a man he'd never met, he'd have thought they were crazy. "You think we can make this work?" Roy asked. Chester folded the deed carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "I think 2 old men who've both learned something about patience might be exactly what that land needs." They drove home through mountain air that smelled like pine and snow, carrying papers that transformed them from strangers into family. They drove home in comfortable silence, each man lost in thoughts too complex for easy conversation. The legal documents that lay between them on the truck's bench seat represented more than a simple property transfer. They marked the end of a 60-year injustice and the beginning of something neither man had quite expected to find in his remaining years. When they reached the house, Chester parked near the workshop and sat for a moment without turning off the engine, looking at the property with eyes that held a different kind of ownership now. Legal title meant something, even to a man who'd been acting as owner for over 2 decades. "There's something I want to show you," Chester said, climbing out of the truck. "Been saving it for the right moment." Roy followed Chester to the workshop, watching as the old man opened a wooden chest that had been tucked away in the corner. From it, Chester withdrew a hand-carved wooden box, its surface polished to a warm glow that spoke of careful attention over many years. Inside the box, wrapped in faded cloth, was a letter written in a woman's careful handwriting. The paper was soft with age, and the ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clear enough to read. "Letter. Sarah wrote to me a few months before she died," Chester said, handling the paper with reverent care. "She knew I was struggling with what to do after she was gone. Always could see right through me, that woman." Chester handed Roy the letter, inviting him to read what felt like a deeply personal communication between husband and wife. Roy hesitated, but Chester's nod encouraged him to continue. Asterisk. "My dearest Chester," asterisk, the letter began. Asterisk, "I know you're reading this after I'm gone, probably sitting in that workshop of yours and wondering what comes next. You always were, one to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, even when the world didn't ask you to. Asterisk, asterisk, I've been thinking about your family's land in the mountains, the place your grandfather built with his own hands. I know it still hurts that your father lost it, and I know you blame yourself for not being able to help him keep it. But maybe some losses happen for reasons we don't understand until much later. Asterisk, asterisk. If you ever get the chance to go back to that land, don't go alone. The mountains are beautiful, but they're not meant for solitary living. Take someone with you who needs healing as much as you do. Share the work and the worry and the wonder of it all. Asterisk, asterisk, I believe with all my heart that land recognizes love, and love shared is stronger than love carried alone. Your grandfather didn't build that homestead just for himself. He built it for family, for community, for the connections that make life worth living. Asterisk, asterisk. So, when you go home to the mountains, and you will go home, Chester Williams, because that land is calling you back. Make sure you bring someone who can help you remember that a house is just wood and stone until it's filled with the laughter and conversation and shared meals that make it a home. Asterisk, asterisk, all my love, always and forever, Sarah, asterisk. Roy read the letter twice, understanding that Sarah Williams had somehow foreseen not just Chester's return to his family's land, but the loneliness that would drive him there and the companionship he would need to find healing. "She wrote this before you ever came up here?" Roy asked. 3 months before she died. I found it tucked in her Bible after the funeral." Chester's voice was soft with memory. Thought she was just being hopeful, but Sarah had a way of knowing things before they happened. "You think she knew you'd find someone to share the place with?" "I think she knew I'd need to, whether I admitted it or not." Chester carefully folded the letter and returned it to its wooden box. "Sarah always said the best gifts were the ones that showed up disguised as problems." Roy thought about that observation, about how his desperate purchase of a $5 house had turned into something far more valuable than the shelter he'd been seeking. "You think that's what I was? A gift disguised as a problem? I think you were a man looking for a place to disappear, who found a place to belong instead." Chester closed the wooden box and returned it to its spot in the chest. "And I think I was a man so busy preserving the past that I forgot about building a future." They walked back to the house together, noting how the afternoon shadows fell across property that now legally belonged to Chester Williams and morally belonged to both of them. The mountains rose around them like protective walls, and the house stood solid and welcoming in the clearing his great-grandfather had carved from wilderness over a century ago. "What would you like for dinner?" Chester asked, as they climbed the front steps Roy had rebuilt. "Feel like celebrating." "Whatever you're cooking is fine with me, partner," Roy replied, and the word felt right in ways he hadn't expected. Chester paused on the porch, looking back at Roy, with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper. "You know what Sarah would say about today?" "What's that?" "She'd say, justice isn't about getting back what was taken from you. It's about making sure the taking stops and the healing begins." Chester opened the front door and gestured for Roy to enter first. "Welcome to your real home, Roy Baxter." Roy stepped into the house that had sheltered the Williams family for generations, understanding finally that home wasn't something you bought or inherited or claimed. It was something you built with patience and purpose, and the kind of partnership that transformed two lonely men into something larger than either could be alone. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and watchful, holding space for whatever came next. Spring arrived early that year, melting the last of winter's snow by mid-March, and revealing ground that seemed eager to support new growth. Roy stood in what had once been Sarah's planned vegetable garden, turning soil that Chester had been preparing for over 2 decades, but had never quite found the energy to plant alone. The earth was rich and dark, improved by years of careful composting and the kind of patient attention that transformed ordinary dirt into something capable of sustaining life. Tomatoes go in the back row. Chester called from where he was assembling a trellis system he'd designed over the winter. They'll need the most sun, and the trellis will keep them from shading the smaller plants. Roy paused in his digging, noting how Chester moved with more energy than he'd shown in the months they'd known each other. The legal resolution of the property ownership had lifted a weight from the old man's shoulders that Roy was only now beginning to understand. Chester Williams was no longer a squatter maintaining someone else's abandoned property. He was home, working land his family had claimed and lost and reclaimed, building something that would outlast both of them. The shared garden tools they were using had been Chester's Christmas gift to their partnership, new shovels and hoes and hand cultivators to replace the worn implements they'd been making do with. But more than tools, they represented investment in a future that extended beyond simple maintenance into actual growth and productivity. "What about peppers?" Roy asked, pointing to a section of ground that caught morning sun but would be shaded during the hottest part of the day. "Perfect spot for them. Sarah always said peppers liked morning warmth but afternoon protection." Chester tested the tension on the trellis wires, adjusting them with the perfectionism of someone who understood that small details mattered when you were building something to last. The mention of Sarah no longer carried the sharp edge of grief that Roy had noticed during their early conversations. Chester spoke of his wife now with the kind of fond remembering that honored memory without being trapped by it. Sarah's wisdom had become part of the foundation they were building together, her insights about land and love woven into the daily decisions that shaped their shared life. "Tommy Rodriguez stopped by while you were in town," Roy said, returning to his digging. "His wife, Maria, wants to know if we'll have extra vegetables to trade for some of her canned goods." "Good idea. Maria's salsa is better than anything you can buy in the stores." Chester moved to the next section of trellis, working with the steady rhythm of someone who had found his proper pace. "Community's important up here. People need to be able to count on each other." Roy had learned that lesson over the winter, when neighbors had checked on them during storms and offered help with projects too big for 2 men to handle alone. The mountain community Chester had been part of for over 20 years had welcomed Roy with the kind of acceptance that came from understanding what it meant to choose this life, the isolation and beauty and self-reliance that defined existence at altitude. "Thinking about building a greenhouse," Chester said, looking at a spot near the workshop where morning sun would provide optimal growing conditions. "Extend the growing season, maybe have fresh greens through the winter." "Big project," Roy observed. "Big enough to take us a couple of years to do it right. But we've got time." Chester's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who was planning for a future he intended to share. "Besides, Sarah always wanted a greenhouse. Said she dreamed of having fresh herbs all winter long." Roy understood that the greenhouse would be more than a practical addition to their homestead. It would be a monument to Sarah's vision, a way of honoring her memory while creating something that served the living. Everything they built together seemed to carry that dual purpose, respect for the past and investment in whatever years remained to them. The afternoon brought visitors Tommy Rodriguez and his teenage son Miguel, who'd come to help with the heavier work of setting fence posts for the garden perimeter. Roy watched Chester interact with the boy, noting the patient way he explained techniques for digging post holes and setting proper depth. Chester had become a grandfather figure to several families in the area, sharing skills and wisdom with a younger generation that would carry mountain traditions forward. "Mister, Chester knows everything about living up here," Miguel said to Roy during a water break. "My dad says he's the smartest man in these mountains." "Your dad's probably right," Roy replied, watching Chester demonstrate the proper way to brace a corner post. "But don't tell him I said that. He's already too proud for his own good." When the work was finished and their visitors had headed home, Roy and Chester sat on the front porch with glasses of sweet tea, surveying the day's accomplishments. The garden area was laid out and ready for planting. The greenhouse site was marked and partially excavated, and plans were taking shape for summer projects that would continue the slow but steady improvement of the property. "You know what Sarah would say about all this?" Chester asked, gesturing toward the garden and the mountains beyond. "What's that?" "She'd say we finally learned the difference between owning something and belonging to it." Chester's voice carried the contentment of someone who had found his proper place in the world. "Took us long enough, but I think we got there." Roy sipped his tea and considered the journey that had brought him to this porch, this partnership, this sense of purpose he'd thought was lost forever. 6 months ago, he'd been a man running from his past, buying a $5 house where he could disappear from the world. Now he was part of something larger, a community, a legacy, a future that honored the past while building toward tomorrow. "Think she'd approve of how things turned out?" Roy asked. Chester smiled, looking out at property that stretched toward mountains that would outlast them all. "I think she'd say, it's about time 2 stubborn old men learned that the best things in life are worth sharing." As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in colors that would be gone within minutes and remembered forever, Roy Baxter understood that he had found what he'd been looking for without ever knowing he was searching for it. He was home,